Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Miles Davis, Birth of the Cool. Miles Davis, Birth of the Cool is a 2019 Stanley Nelson Jr. documentary about the life and career of the jazz legend. Clocking in at about 2 hours, the film features a collection of clips, photos, and interviews with his contemporaries and collaborators. The documentary doesn't just tick along the timeline of Miles' life, but rather dives into the highs and lows of his personal life, as well as how they affected the creative process behind the music. Prior to checking out this documentary, I really didn't know much about Miles Davis. I knew that he was a jazz musician who played the trumpet and was married to Cicely Tyson during the 1980s. Now, how they got together or why they broke up, I really didn't know. This tiny bit that I did know came about from some article or clip where he mentioned that he had a weave, which automatically caught my attention, and he got into an argument with Cicely Tyson after chatting up some neighbor. I was so confused by the scene he explained, but equally intrigued. I really didn't know much about his music as far as particular songs that he'd created or in which he'd played. So often with a lot of black musicians of the past, it seemed like their origin story was that they grew up poor in some rural area, maybe on a farm. It is what it is, so there's nothing wrong with that. But in this case, I was actually quite surprised to find out that Davis came from a rather comfortable family, as his father was a dentist. Davis was born in 1926, so for a black man to be a dentist at that time is pretty remarkable. And as is pointed out, he grew up in a small town in southern Illinois across the Mississippi River from Missouri. His dad then moved the family to East St. Louis. I smiled when this was mentioned because I knew that a few decades later, Anna Mae Bullock would also move to the area and become Tina Turner, so there's a lot of history in the town. At the time the Davis family arrived in East St. Louis, it hadn't yet become a big city. This enabled the family to have a house in the city area, but also a farm with cows and other stuff out in the more rural area. I'm not sure of its accuracy, but it's mentioned that the elder Davis was the second wealthiest man in the state of Illinois at that time. From the way it was worded, not the second wealthiest black man, but the second wealthiest man in general, it indicates that the elder Davis was doing quite well for himself, especially for that time. Yet the Davis family's wealth could not fully protect them from racism and discrimination, as this was still the period of Jim Crow. It's always interesting when listening to the stories of people's lives, how a simple event sets them on one path versus another. From a very young age, Davis was regarded as being a genius, but also a little bit weird. When Davis was in junior high school, his parents decided to get him an instrument for his birthday. His dad got him a new trumpet, while his mom wanted him to play violin. Miles would go on to make his mark in the world as a legendary trumpet player. I'm sure he would have still been talented and done great things as a violinist, but imagine how different his life and music history might have been. It's possible that he might not have gone into jazz, but rather some other musical genre like classical music, where he would have been playing in like some orchestra. His father and the trumpet won out over his mother and the violin, but part of that conversation is also the contentious and violent relationship between his mother and father. Davis grew up in a household where his mother and father constantly argued, but it wasn't just verbal disagreements, as they would sometimes turn physical. He mentions at one point that his mother and father got into an argument, in which case I think it was about the instrument he should play. His mother was picking up objects and throwing them at his father, to which his father responded by punching his mother in the mouth, which knocked out some of her teeth. It was an incredibly petty argument and an unnecessarily violent exchange. This was not a positive environment for a child to be growing up in. It's not a positive example of how to have a healthy romantic relationship between a man and a woman. These early examples of dysfunctional behavior that Miles grew up seeing in his household had an impact on him and played a role in his later relationships with women. As with most musicians, Miles began playing as the newbie in a band and worked his way up the chain. Because of his dad's support, Miles was able to continue attending school while also playing in the band on the side. Meanwhile, the other band members had day jobs and were playing at night. Miles was able to focus a lot of his attention on music, which allowed him to take on more playing and creative responsibilities within the band, and he eventually became the band leader. After graduating from high school, he had the opportunity to sit in on a session with Billy Eckstein'S band. This was significant because there were a lot of other future legends such as Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker playing in the band. These were still early days for the musicians, but it offered an opportunity for them to meet and inspire each other and start forming the collaborative relationships that would help to shape jazz. This was also an important session because it motivated Miles to leave his hometown to move to New York, because the clubs along 52nd Street were becoming the epicenter for jazz. Miles makes a pretty astute observation, and I'm paraphrasing here, that for people who aspire to be creative, change is necessary. This is because creativity is either reimagining things as they currently are or imagining something that doesn't yet exist and making it a reality. Think of Jimi Hendrix playing the Star-Spangled Banner on electric guitar, where it sounds completely different, or jazz musicians improvising and creating completely new songs on the fly. I've noticed something after several years of reading and watching documentaries about different Black American musicians and creative people. In the 1900s, up to and even during the Civil Rights Movement, when they achieved some degree of success, or as soon as the opportunity presented itself, they would spend time in Europe, seemingly Paris in particular. There seemed to be a sense of freedom that they felt there, in part because their creativity seemed to receive more recognition and appreciation by the general public that they weren't necessarily feeling in America. For example, Josephine Baker and later James Baldwin and Nina Simone. Based on this, I used to think that either there wasn't racism in Europe or maybe not as much in comparison to America. I've since learned that's not the case, as it seems that racism was still a thing, but might have just presented differently. For these creatives, it might have been more a matter of being celebrities and moving in different circles compared to the average Black person in Europe. Therefore, the experiences that they had were different and positive for many of them. And being a tourist who visits for work or a vacation is different from living somewhere. In this case, Davis met a lady with whom he fell in love, but he'd already had children in America with his high school sweetheart. It seems like in Paris, away from the responsibilities and difficulties of his day-to-day life, Miles felt like a sense of freedom, and coming back to America plunged him into a very deep depression. I initially took it for granted that sometimes you have this feeling returning from a great vacation, whatever's the opposite of homesickness, far sickness maybe, dismay at having to go back home and get back to your regular life after having a period of freedom. But for Miles, it was actually a very deep depression, which served as the catalyst for him becoming addicted to heroin. The manner in which it ravished his life was surprising. Things got to the point where his father came to check on him, and when he saw what was going on, marched him off the stage and took him back home to East St. Louis. It was an attempt to get him to sober up and kick the habit, but I thought it was rather sweet and an incredible act of love on his father's part. It's like, you might be a grown man, but it's still my child, and I'll step in to help you when it's obvious that you need it. Unfortunately, he was so far gone that he plunged right back into his drug use in New York. One of the interviewees said that you'd see Davis out and wouldn't even recognize him, as he'd look like some random homeless person on the street because he'd become so consumed with heroin. A bright point is that unlike a lot of other artists, it sounds like at least some of his personal and industry friends tried to help him rather than being yes men and enabling him. They made an effort to not give him money in an attempt to prevent him from buying drugs. He was going through a really rough period in his life that began with a seemingly inconsequential trigger like returning from a work trip. This is something with which a lot of people struggle, and unfortunately seems to play a role in the lives of many famous, though not all, creatives. Many people seem to struggle with dealing with life and the world as they are. For some, music, art, writing, or some other creative outlet is a way for them to express their feelings and process their emotions. Some reach a point where their art isn't enough to deal with whatever it is that they have going on internally, and they start seeking some other form of external relief. Instead of positive coping mechanisms, some turn to drugs, alcohol, sex, or some other addictive thing, which ends up taking their life off course, plunging them even further into the abyss of depression. At first, when the focus returned to music in the period of bebop, I thought to myself that, I don't think I like this kind of music. But as the documentary moved on, there's conversation about Davis playing at a festival where there were several record executives present. It's at this point that they touch on his music from that period, and Davis physically changed in the way that he played as far as positioning the trumpet right up against the microphone. There were some clips of music played at that point, and I got it. It was now like a whole mood. Recently, I've reviewed quite a few Spike Lee films, and I know that Lee's dad is a jazz musician who created the scores for some of his films. Lee's films, especially the early movies, contain quite a bit of jazz, and this part of Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool reminded me of those films. They were discussing the vibe of vulnerability within the music, and it's quite beautiful, romantic even. Yet it's not sappy or overdone as it might have been in some other genres. I like soul, rockers, R&B, etc., and I started to get into the music at this point because it was so smooth and relaxing. This is a music that I could listen to while driving because it might make you too relaxed, but I could see listening to this era of Miles Davis as mood music while reading, soaking in the tub, maybe a nice dinner, some other quiet moment. This is totally a vibe. I got it at that point, what people in the audience might have felt when they heard Miles Davis playing these songs in this way for the first time. And then adding to the vibe was that within the documentary, there were black and white photos adding to the mood. I love black and white photography. So from a visual standpoint, this was like a high point of the documentary for me. The combination of music and images spoke to me and made me smile. And it just got better from there, as there was then discussion of Davis creating the soundtracks for a French film. I love movies too. If you think of old detective films or Humphrey Bogart movies, where being black and white somehow adds another layer to the film. Despite the lack of color, black and white photography in film can convey a lot of feeling that you sometimes don't get with color, especially if the focus of the lens is just a little soft and adds a lush, dreamy feeling. And then consider film scores, where in more recent years, they take songs and drop them in at places in the film. It's typically a full song where a clip is taken and dropped in at some random point in the film. But they explained that back then they would hire a full band and have them play to fill the space that was in need of music. The way that Miles Davis did it was to watch the film and play along with the mood of the scene. Like many jazz musicians, he was improvising, composing in his mind rather than writing the music in advance. It's pretty dope. There's one clip where a character from the film is walking around Paris, and you see him playing on the fly while watching the film on the screen. With many films and now TV shows, the music seems to be an afterthought, where they might take a hit song from a hot artist and just plop it into the film. Sometimes the song has nothing to do with what's taking place in the scene, but might just match the energy or tempo. But here you see Davis tailoring the music to the scene, which is a very creative take. This is some real deal good music, and it brought Davis tremendous commercial success along with financial accessories. I know that chasing your dreams can be hard work, so I'm always cheering for other people who achieve success. This goes doubly for Black people because there are often many obstacles in the path to a Black person becoming successful. I felt especially proud to see photos of Davis during these very successful periods after having learned of the hardships with which he'd struggled. I like seeing old black and white pictures of regular Black people, but also musicians. I actually plan to start a collection of black and white photos of Black actors and musicians. Black people were and still are going through it, so to see photos of Davis and his lady dressed to the nines and stepping out of a Ferrari back then was incredible. Yet there are highs and lows in life, and it seems that when you're riding high in life, the universe, or more accurately, some hater, decides to come along and rain on your parade. While either practicing or appearing at a club, Davis walked a lady outside to catch a cab and remained outside to smoke a cigarette. A police officer came across him and told him to move along, to which Davis inquired why he couldn't remain where he was. Keep in mind, this is at the height of this big blockbuster album that's helped to musically define the era, and he's standing near a marquee that bears his name. Davis points this out as an explanation as to why he's standing around, but upset at having his authority questioned, the officer attacked Davis with what sounds like a billy club. After splitting Davis's head open and getting blood all over his clothes, Davis was arrested and taken to the police station. It sounds like Davis was already a temperamental guy and somewhat unsociable, but this incident added on to some of the feelings that he'd developed along the way since he began experiencing racism back in East St. Louis. He felt that he'd left that small-minded thinking behind in his hometown and wouldn't have to worry in a cosmopolitan and progressive city like New York. The experience reminded him that he was at risk of having to deal with racism anywhere in America. Even minding your own business, some police officer could walk up to you and demand that you move for no clear reason. And specifically because you're Black, that officer could feel comfortable violently attacking you because he can. Friends state that this was something that would stay with Davis for years, and mentally he would randomly go back to that moment and become angry all over again. It's an unfortunate experience that many Black and other marginalized people go through with the police. As children, we're taught to think of the police as the good guys, the people you seek out when things go wrong. But these negative experiences can create a shift in feelings. A lot of young Black and Hispanic men speak about having these experiences where they're stopped and searched, questioned, or otherwise unnecessarily treated aggressively. I'm not a male, but can remember having 2 negative experiences as a Black child in junior high school, and later one incident as an adult. In 2 of those instances, I was actually attempting to report a crime. Because of your color, where you live, etc., some police officers look at you and feel like they have the authority to be rude, dismissive, or physically abusive. Meanwhile, they wouldn't try this kind of stuff in other neighborhoods or with people of another race or perceived income bracket. They might ask questions, but there would be a different tone to the conversation. Being treated in this manner is wrong, regardless of if you're famous or a regular unknown person. But there's a lie told in America that if you stay out of trouble and don't give anyone a hard time, you'll be safe and the police won't have cause to bother you. That the police are there to protect and serve the community until you realize that you're not considered a part of that community. Looking back through the history of American music, Black people have made tremendous contributions, arguably creating many of the genres of American music. Yet it wasn't until maybe the 1950s and heading into the 1960s that Black artists would begin to regularly have mainstream success, especially with regards to crossing over in the record charts. Segregation affected the music and entertainment industry, and quite often Black artists would be limited to particular venues, radio stations, etc. For quite some time, this put a cap on how big a Black artist or band could become. Often, songs by Black artists would be covered by white artists, and because they didn't have the same limitations, their music could be pushed to a wider audience, and the records would shoot up the charts. Even genres of music wouldn't get respect or mainstream opportunities until white artists moved to the forefront or otherwise became involved. This occurred with swing, jazz, blues, and most notably rock and roll. But here it is that Miles Davis was becoming a really big thing in music. Having achieved a great deal of success at Columbia Records, he had the opportunity to exert greater control over the packaging of his music. At this point, he already had artistic control, which is something that a lot of artists didn't have. He had already been making a lot of business decisions, but now began to direct the creative for his albums. There's discussion of a particular collaboration with Gil Evans, where they would create 3 albums together. The first project, Miles Ahead, had a concept, or more a feeling of being a living the high life type album. In an effort to match this feeling, the label put some random white woman and a child on a yacht and used this as the album cover. But this is a Miles Davis album, and he's a Black musician and Black man. And so there's a story of him asking one of the record execs in not so nice terms what this white woman was doing on his album cover. The second pressing of the album used a photo of Miles Davis. One would think you shouldn't have to explain to a record label not to pull nonsense like that. But it was something that used to happen with a lot of people's albums. Never mind that this is a Black musician, the idea seems to have been that to appeal to the masses, Davis couldn't be on the cover. If a person was going to be on the album, it needed to be a white person so that white people would be interested in buying the album. Unfortunately, this continues to be a thing with both music and movies that feature Black people. Not that Black people are still left off the cover, but rather that it's assumed such projects won't appeal to white audiences unless there's at least one white person somewhere in the mix, if not at the forefront. This would often affect TV shows and movies being greenlit, like even until when Black Panther came out. The assumption was that a movie could only be successful to a point with all Black leads, as white people will not consume content when Black people are the primary characters. Continuing to push the envelope, Davis decided to turn this on its head. If he's the one making the music, the album cover is a part of the creative and should reflect him. It's not cool for him to be the one making the music, but then being pushed into the shadows when it comes to promotion. What exactly was the plan for when people came to his live shows? For the Someday My Prince Will Come album, Davis took things a step further and put his then-wife, Frances Taylor Davis, on the cover. He saw himself as her prince and thought she was very beautiful and thus the perfect woman for the cover. This started his trend of featuring Black women on his album covers. It was a matter of saying, you're going to accept me as an artist, and if we're going to put beautiful women on the cover, they can be Black women. It was a sweet but also powerful gesture in that this woman was his inspiration for the album, and in taking more creative control of his albums, he wanted their presentation to better reflect him and what he represented. This is the story of Miles Davis, and I appreciate that the filmmaker and interviewees were honest about the man. As such, he's presented as an incredibly flawed person, and to be honest, I think we all are. Yet in speaking about his marriage to Taylor, what started as sounding beautiful with regard to the album covers became increasingly dysfunctional and problematic. Taylor was a dancer and actress with ties to the Katherine Dunham Company, Paris Opera Ballet, and various Broadway and off-Broadway musicals. She was already well into this career when she met Miles Davis. In fact, her talent and having the body of a dancer played a role in attracting his attention. Out of hundreds of aspiring dancers, she was selected as an original cast member for West Side Story, which ended up being a big production. Due to Davis's insecurities and sexism, he felt like it was okay for him to be the successful one, getting all of the attention and adoration, but he wanted the spotlight to just be on him, as he couldn't handle the woman that he was with also having her own energy. She could have her own thing going on, but only to a certain level. Her having an equally successful career that brought her attention separately from him and people wanting to be around her was unacceptable. That jealousy, coupled with him drinking and using cocaine, led to him being paranoid about their relationship. In situations like this, sometimes it can be insecurity within yourself, where any kind of attention on your partner can feel as though it's taking away from you. But it might also stoke your fears that this person might meet somebody else, so there was a certain possessiveness about Taylor. And with that, Davis pressured her into leaving the production of West Side Story. His ridiculous reason was that he felt a woman's place was with her man, and as his woman, she couldn't be with him and be in the show at the same time because it would require her doing her own thing and moving about independent of him. Unfortunately, she gave in and left the production. I felt for her because it was obvious that this was something that she was very passionate about. It was quite selfish on his part because he'd sacrificed and worked hard to make himself a successful musician. He'd actually left his childhood sweetheart and children behind in East St. Louis to chase his dreams. Davis met this woman and knew from the beginning that she was a dancer and actress. It's not like they'd agreed upon meeting that she'd be a housewife and then she suddenly decided to pursue this career path 10 or 15 years into their marriage. Even if that had been the case, I would think you try to be supportive as long as they're not doing something crazy or unsafe. But in this case, his selfishness and insecurities pushed him to clip her wings. He wanted to be the only one in the relationship allowed to have dreams and aspirations, or more importantly, the only one allowed to chase after them. I felt for her because there's a sense that she's an older woman now and decades have gone past. But looking back over her life, she's probably spent a lot of time thinking about how different her life might have been if she hadn't left the show to make Davis happy. It's not for me to tell anybody what to do in their relationship, but if this is something positive that you're passionate about, by all means, I think you should strive for it. This might mean that we sit down and have a conversation about adjusting our plans, and it could call for compromises on both sides. But both people in a relationship should feel appreciated and supported. Everyone isn't going to be everyone else's cup of tea, but this is where compatibility comes into play. I don't understand meeting someone that does A, knowing you want someone that does B, and then trying to change them to B once you're married or otherwise in a relationship. If it's important to you, the other person doesn't have to suddenly also become interested or passionate about it as well, but they should support your interests. You shouldn't have to give up the things that make you feel complete or the things that bring you joy. Even within a relationship, both people can have their own individual passions and interests that aren't necessarily shared by the other person. Life is short. If you find something in life that you're passionate about, you owe it to yourself to chase after that dream or explore that interest. That's not to say you should be reckless or do things to jeopardize your relationship. And I say this as someone who's creative with a variety of interests, so maybe I see things differently. But I was surprised at Davis being a passionate creative, but wholly unsupportive of his wife having a similar creative passion. It's not just a matter of him being uninterested or unsupportive, but artificially adding obstacles to her pursuing her career. He went so far as to bring his kids from East St. Louis to live with them in New York City to occupy her time. The woman doesn't cook, but you suddenly decide she needs to learn so she can feed the kids. It doesn't sound like he decided to play a greater role in the lives of his children and wanted them closer. Instead, he was just looking for stuff to occupy her time and keep her in the house. Just all kinds of petty and selfish. You claim you love this woman, but are then doing seemingly everything possible to push her away. It's like the insecurity that she'd meet someone and leave him led to self-sabotage, where he was going to make her so miserable that she probably would look for someone else, or at least just to get away from him. Taylor sounds like she loved and was good to him, but he felt like he didn't deserve her, so he began orchestrating the demise of the relationship. An innocent conversation with someone at a party, or even mentioning in passing that a man is handsome, in this case Quincy Jones, is a major issue. We all have our insecurities and might occasionally experience jealousy. It's one thing if your partner is indeed being shady, but if there's nothing to indicate that your partner is being unfaithful, and they also offer reassurances that nothing's going on, then you kind of have to check yourself. As in a lot of these cases, Davis's jealousy, attempt to isolate his wife, and verbal abuse escalated to physical abuse. Unless you or someone else is in physical danger, there's never a reason for you to become violent with your partner. It says a lot about Taylor as a person that despite him being Miles Davis and whatever lifestyle that might afford, she didn't let that fill her eyes. It wasn't a reason for her to stay with him and tolerate his ill treatment. She deserved more, not just because of who she was or whatever talents and abilities she might have had, but simply because she's a human being. Nobody was put on earth to be anybody else's punching bag. There was definitely a message in that, as well as the progression of the relationship. Here it is that you have this insanely talented individual being creative, emotional, depressed, or whatever else you might have going on, doesn't excuse you mistreating other people. Everyone explained what was going on, but I appreciated that nobody, including Davis, attempted to justify or excuse his behavior. They openly and honestly discussed his flaws just as readily as his merits. Davis offered his perspective as a man looking back over his life decades later, having recognized the wrongs that he had done and accepted accountability. It's a tough subject to address, but I respected the way that it was handled. There were no attempts to sugarcoat, romanticize, or otherwise downplay these incidents. Watching Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool, I began to feel like there was this intermittent thing of Davis going into these moods which popped up throughout the documentary. He had periods of being happy, but would plunge into these periods of deep depression. And throughout his life, it seemed like he experienced difficulty connecting to other people. He would be clean for a while, but would begin experiencing depression and relapse, picking back up his addiction, which likely just made the depression worse. The first time around it was heroin, the second time alcohol and painkillers, and the third time was alcohol and cocaine. I'm not a medical professional and certainly have no qualifications to diagnose mental health issues, but it does sound as though Davis might have had some kind of mental health or emotional issue. He certainly had periods of depression, but it doesn't sound like it was a matter of him occasionally being a bit sad. It was like deep and sustained unhappiness that would upend his life. It seems like he was basically self-medicating by using drugs and alcohol to deal with these moods. I'm assuming, but it would seem that help with mental health issues was not readily available then, or maybe people weren't as readily seeking it out. Mental health is still a taboo subject in the present, and most certainly was back then, in part because he was creative and drugs seem to be more openly used in the entertainment industry. People sometimes excuse addiction as being a quirk of creative people. Ultimately, Miles Davis was a grown man, and nobody would have been able to make him do anything that he didn't want to do. It certainly sounds like he might have benefited from some kind of therapy and or mental health care. It's unfortunate because here it is that you have this man who's incredibly creative and through music is given such joy and pleasure to other people. But within his own life, he doesn't seem to be fully enjoying his life and success. He might have had some of the material trappings, but didn't get to fully enjoy it in the sense that he seemed to kind of be going through the motions with some of like these things. Buying the cars that you buy when you're successful, dating and being with the women that you're supposed to date when you're successful, but then still having this unhappiness within himself. He was fortunate to meet and fall in love with several women. It doesn't really sound like he was a womanizer because throughout the film you hear about him being in relationships, but his unaddressed issues got in the way of him being able to be happy and content in a healthy relationship. Being what sounds like mentally unhealthy led to him exhibiting unhealthy behaviors within these relationships. There are multiple stories of him lashing out and becoming violent with women. These issues got in the way of him having happy and fulfilling relationships, but not just romantic relationships, friendships as well. Leaving his romantic interest and a friend alone for literally minutes, and then accusing and badgering his friend about having sex with the woman. That's a lot for anyone to deal with. Despite his personal demons, Miles Davis was to a degree able to work around them. It's incredible from the perspective that you get to understand his creative process in general, but also the creative process behind particular albums as far as the things that inspired them and how they came together. But on the flip side, it's sad to hear about him struggling with these various issues. I'll be honest and state that not all of the music resonated with me, but I thought it was interesting to see all of the projects come together. He was a musician for about 50 years and in the industry for 40 plus years, yet was only 65 when he died. Davis was middle-aged, though still relatively young when he died, and looking back over his life, it's interesting that he lived through and adapted to several eras and styles of music. He began establishing himself as a jazz legend during the 1940s, grew commercially during the major changes of the 60s, and remained active for the most part through the 70s and 80s. And consider that he took breaks at some points and explored different musical genres, which enabled him to adapt and change his style over time. That in and of itself is pretty amazing because many artists are unable to adapt as they don't experiment or learn, grow, or otherwise challenge themselves over time. They become so tied to a trend, style, or period in music which leads to their downfall. But here is a musician that took it upon himself to seek out and find inspiration from across the spectrum of music. His willingness to change with the times allowed him to reinvent himself, switch up his style, and collaborate with new artists. That speaks to his talent and creativity in the sense that he wasn't a one-trick pony. He wasn't just a jazz man. He wasn't just a soul man. Instead, he was an all-around musician. It wasn't mentioned here, but I read a story from Cicely Tyson about Michael Jackson and Miles Davis in the 1980s. He was the biggest artist at the time, and she, like many other people, was in awe of him. Davis gave Jackson his props, but then turned around and showed his own skill by interpreting one of Jackson's popular songs on the trumpet, and according to Tyson, it was a dazzling rendition. Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool is a phenomenal documentary. Prior to watching, I didn't know much about the man beyond him being like a legendary jazz musician, but by the end, I felt like I had a good look into not just Miles Davis' career, but also him as a man, and I value that. The documentary was well put together and is definitely worth checking out, especially if you're unfamiliar with Miles Davis and or jazz. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more movie recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.